So, Amos, I suppose we could start this endeavor with defining some terms, because definitions are important to clarify things. So I suppose we could start off by asking you what you think of God and miracles, and the relationship between God and miracles to science, and perhaps define these three things if you want to at the start. Yeah.
Wow. Yes, thank you for having me on here, but that's a very difficult question. So I'm quite sure I will not succeed in defining all three of those very succinctly, but maybe we can work at it together a bit. So I think maybe science is for me the easiest one to start with. So I think, as we have touched upon already a couple of times, there is always some philosophical basic assumption or axiom that every worldview rests on. And as far as I understand, the science rests on this axiom of materialism. So the world is made out of matter, of maybe atoms or maybe smaller particles, and these atoms have certain characteristics and therefore behave in a certain way, and then we can observe their behavior, and these characteristics are stable across time. So that means that observations of the material world that we make today, we can, if we understand the causes correctly, then we can make predictions about future events in the material world, because they will follow the same cause and effect, the same link between cause and effect. So the same cause will lead to the same effect. And this is, of course, an axiom that underlies the scientific method or the scientific process. And so, yes, I think that God is very difficult to define. It might even be impossible, but we should try to box this to box it in a little bit, so we know what we are talking about. And yeah, I'm having a hard time. Maybe you have some thoughts to this point.
Right. Yes, that's a very good point. That of course the question of God in himself is a big question. So yeah, I suppose starting off with understanding science is a very good way to begin the discussion, and then take it from there, in a sense. Well, I suppose as you said, materialism concerns that the world is completely material, and therefore in that worldview, God cannot exist if materialism is what one presupposes in that view, because God would be inherently immaterial. Now, if I were to sort of define God, I would sort of say that he is the source and foundation of all reality, or the source of being itself. Because to talk about it in a very deep philosophical understanding of the world, you could say that everything has being, everything has existence. That existence is something that makes things exist. They have being, and this being is grounded in some fundamental absolute source of all existence and all reality, and this is God. And one could sort of derive properties of God based on that if God is the absolute foundation of reality, then one could say that he is necessary. He doesn't depend on anything else for his existence. He is unchanging. He is perfect. Those are, of course, things that one can discuss, these properties, but at least those are attributed to the monotheistic God. and one could say that they are derived from God being the absolute foundation of all reality. And he would be immaterial, and we could sort of dive into why that is. But at least we could see that if we presuppose materialism or naturalism, one would then have to exclude God because he's in the supernatural realm. But naturalism thinks that only the natural observable world or material world exist, or that we can only know about the material world. One could sort of distinguish between philosophical naturalism, saying that only natural things exist, or methodological naturalism, which is that we don't know if there is a supernatural realm, but we can only know about the natural world, and that science can only concern itself with material things. That is a method or methodological presupposition that many would have concerning science, that science can only deal with material things. And this is, of course, relevant to the whole question of miracles as well. But at least I hope this could be sort of valuable to sort of understand what God or who God is, and his relation to this materialist philosophy as we mentioned.
I think that's a good starting point. Though it's already getting complicated, because one thing that you could, so I feel like you have a little bit presupposed that the origin of being or of existence is non-material, but this doesn't seem to me necessarily to be the case. So you could say, like Spinoza did, that God is just, if you say, okay, only matter exists as a materialist, and then you say God is the source or foundation of existence, then it would just be all the matter that exists equals God. I don't think this is very useful, but yes, so I find it hard if you, or it's difficult to talk about non-material sources of existence, at least in a materialist perspective. This doesn't make sense, as you said. So there, I think, is one problem. I think I would like to briefly try to explain how what I understand at the moment under this under the term or the name God. So I think in my mind, God is something like a model. It's a model of reality, and so we can have different models of reality, and these different models are useful for different questions in the end. Of course, this is quite a science influenced view of the world. So for example, we have the model that every material object is made out of atoms, and this leads to certain things that we can then say about the behavior of these objects, and this model is actually quite useful to make certain predictions about reality. But I think that the model that there is something like an omniscient, omnipotent, whatever kind of being that sees everything you do and kind of takes note of how you behave, and that in the end of your life you will have to be accountable for this. So the whole religious model of God, which is very big and which we cannot do maybe, or it's not easy to summarize it briefly, that this model is also very useful because if you behave according to this model, then this will lead to certain outcomes in society and in interactions with human beings which will actually be desirable outcomes. And so that's a little bit a start of how I understand this term at the moment.
Right. Well, I suppose one might say that God can be understood in the context of a model as the philosophy theism, because theism, that is the philosophy or the position that God does exist. So I suppose we could say that theism might be such a model that you're referring to. But the relevant object or content which makes theism unique is God himself. So I think that perhaps theism could be understood sort of as a model in a sense, but that when we try to define God, we have to go to what attributes does he have, what is his identity so far as we can understand. And therefore, when we define God, we have to concern ourselves with that. And perhaps we can include him in a model, but that would be sort of secondary to understanding what God is in himself, the divine essence, if someone wants to talk about that. Though it could be argued that we don't really understand the divine essence, but at least we can understand attributes of God. And I would think that God in the traditional theistic sense, and also more modern theistic senses, is this source of all being, source of, and foundation of all reality, the necessary being that keeps everything else in existence. Now, I also want to clarify that you have these mythological gods, these polytheistic gods, like in Hinduism or Greek mythology, but I'm not talking about those, because those would be limited beings that live specifically a place up in the sky or some other place, and they have both good and evil sides, and they have all sorts of limitations. So those would not be understood as the God in the monotheistic sense. That would rather be this ultimate foundation of all reality. And in this theistic tradition, it would be understood that God is immaterial, that he always has had this attribute. Now, of course, there is the question of, well, why should we think God is immaterial instead of material, as you pointed out? And then one would need to provide perhaps arguments for why God must be immaterial. But at least the point here is just to describe how God is understood in the theistic sense, and he has always, to my knowledge, been understood in this immaterial being. Now, arguments for his immateriality, that would be a separate thing, but of course we could go into this because that's very relevant to the question of God's existence. But yes, I think this definition of God would be a great starting point, that he's the source of reality. And when it comes to this model that theism provides, then yes, it would be the implications of God's existence, perhaps, that he sustains the world in existence. He has the power to intervene in the world when it comes to miracles. Now, when it comes to the question of human beings having to be accountable for their lives after this one, that would be a more, you could say, Christian aspect of theism, which perhaps is not necessarily derived from God philosophically, but rather something that is derived from the Christian faith, which is sort of an additional thing, a revelation in addition to the philosophical truths about God. Right. So I'm not sure where you want to take it from there. Should we perhaps move on to define miracles or talk more about the arguments? But what do you think?
I think we could also define miracles, though I think there is still also one thing that I also wanted maybe to clarify a little bit is existence in what sense, because I think many, at least materialists, have a problem with this statement that something like God exists, because he certainly doesn't exist like a rock or like plank of wood or something. So I think there are different ways in which we say that something can exist. So something can exist as an entity, or something can also, more abstract things can exist, but these are more relationships or maybe principles or things like that. So for example, if you would say, does love exist? Or maybe even more simple, does distance exist? Well, distance doesn't exist like a rock, because distance is a relationship between two entities, and therefore it doesn't exist in the same way as the entities themselves, but it still exists. I mean, if there are two things, then there is a distance between them. And so, yes, I'm not sure, or how to apply this now to God, but I think it's quite important to say, for example, if you would say that I don't know, yes, for example, as you said, God is like the absolute foundation or the source of existence, then probably there is something that could qualify as that, but it will not be something like existing in the same manner as a rock. So yes. And also the question is, if you say, for example, there is some kind of principle that seems to guide the world, that seems to guide how things develop in the material world, or maybe also in the social world, then yes, such a principle probably exists. It's probably quite complicated, but it doesn't exist again in the same form as a rock. So yes, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you brought on very, very good points there. Very, very good points. Because existence must perhaps be clarified, because you can talk about things existing in different senses, as you pointed out. Like there is, you can have rocks or trees or cars existing, but also you have distances existence, as you pointed out. Or other examples would perhaps be a system, let's say the economic system of socialism, because socialism existed in the Soviet Union. However, socialism is not a thing that you can touch. It's not a thing that has being. It's rather just describing a specific organization of different things, or relationship between things. So yeah, I think you pointed out some very good points there. So therefore, I would say that when you talk about existence in this relevant sense, it would be things that have being. They have they have being. Being is understood as something that exists, that has perhaps concrete existence, and which and it would make a difference whether it has being or not being, because a rock is something that exists. It's something that is there. And it's possible that the rock would not exist, but it does exist. So we could perhaps say that the rock has being. It's not simply an abstract understanding of different beings, but it has being itself, or it has being, I would say. So when we talk about the existence of God, it would be understood as the source of all being, or the source of all substance, if you want to talk about substance as well, something that has a being and exists independently as its own entity or thing. So God would be the source of being and have unlimited being. He would be being itself, because you could say that all things in the world around us that has being are limited in some sense. They have some things that they can do, some properties, but there are some things that they can't do. That there's some things that they are unable to do because their nature or essence prevents them from doing this or that on the other thing. But with God, his essence or being is unlimited. He's not limited by anything at all. So he would be understood as being in the same sense, or not in the same sense, but at least we would have being, and other things in the world also has being. Now, of course, there is this understanding in the classical theistic tradition, like Saint Thomas Aquinas talked about this, that when we talk about the existence of God or being of God, we cannot understand that directly, but rather analogously. That being in this world is rather an analogy to the complete and full and supreme being of God. For instance, when it comes to this idea of analogy of being, which Thomas Aquinas talked about, we have analogies that we talk about things in different levels. For instance, when you eat some great breakfast, you could say this breakfast was good, and then you have another sense of the word good when you talk about this person is a good man. Then you talk about goodness in a higher and other sense, but still there is still a connection with goodness being in food that is good, and also goodness in a morally good person. There is still a similarity between those two terms, but still there is a difference as well. So one would perhaps say that the being of God is in that sense, it's on a higher level. So we can sort of, it has something to do with the being in the world around us, but it's even in a higher and more supreme sense, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, that was interesting. Thank you. I think I have a question. So as you were talking, I wondered if you would agree that what you have been trying to describe as God sounds to me a little bit like the concept of existence. So it's because if you ask what is existence, then it's also very hard to really say it. It's just that, yes, some things exist. And so I'm just thinking how to put it in words. So yes, you said, for example, different things exist, but they are limited in what they can do, because they have maybe different characteristics or limitations. But then it reminds me a little bit of Plato. I wanted to bring up this distinction, Plato and Aristotle, this idea that what is existence as such, which I find is kind of a difficult concept to grasp, but it seems to me as if what you have been describing as God, as like the basis or foundation of all existence, that this is something quite similar to this concept of existence in a pure sense, if you want to talk a little bit like Plato.
Yeah, that's a good question, a very good question. I suppose one would say that when you talk about the concept of existence, the concept itself would be abstract. It would just be a concept. But when you talk about God, he's not. One would say that he's not just abstract, but he has a real, and perhaps people would say a concrete being or essence. Perhaps one would say that his being is higher than concept. So maybe one could say that when you talk about the concept of existence itself, refers to or has the content of being itself, the very being, not the concept of being, but the very being itself, which God is. Because one wouldn't say that God is just an abstract concept, but rather the supreme, real, and perhaps people would say concrete reality of being, not just the concept, but the source of being itself, and it has being itself, not the concept of being, but being itself. I'm not sure if that helped answer the question, but yeah, what do you think of this?
I think it sounds still very similar to Plato to me, because of course Plato, as far as I understand, would say that the pure whatever the pure form or the pure existence is of course higher in his view than each concrete entity that actually exists, because everything that we see in the world is just like an imperfect shadow of the perfect form which exists in some higher world. So if you say that God is not just an abstract concept, but he exists real, but somehow higher than concepts or than reality, then it still reminds me quite a lot of Plato, I think.
Well, I could perhaps mention that there is this theistic view called divine idealism, which sort of put the Platonic ideas about forms and abstract concepts in the theistic tradition, or more specifically the Christian Neoplatonic tradition. And it would talk about the relationship between the forms and God, in the sense that those concepts exist objectively, but as thoughts in the mind of God, because some people would argue that concepts or forms are something that exists in a sense that they are thought of by a mind, a mental reality, because we contain concepts when we think about them in our mind. So the concepts are related to some mind thinking about them. And since the concepts exist objectively, as Plato would say, it would therefore exist as thought in the supreme mind, which is God. So I suppose that would be a relationship people would, or in the classical tradition at least, people would point out. But I would also say that it's absolutely true that there are many similarities between the Platonic forms and God himself. You could really see and compare and find a lot of interesting things. For instance, Plato would talk about the form of the good being the sort of his God, Plato's God. That's the supreme form of everything. Every single other form participates perhaps in this ultimate form of goodness. And I think the classical theistic tradition would completely agree with that when it comes to God as well. He is supreme goodness in itself. So I suppose you could say that those considerations about the Platonic forms, which you talked about just now, are in fact true of God as well. That he is perfect, he is supreme, he is unchangeable, he is truly the supreme being, supreme goodness, and everything else is good and real insofar as it participates in the supreme existence and goodness of God. So I think in these senses, we could talk about the Platonic forms being equal or similar to God in these contexts, if that helps answer the question.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. I was thinking just now that it seems to me almost like it's a little funny. There is always this, basically, if we look at the world, there are higher and higher abstractions or overall categories, and then there are always smaller and smaller aspects of these things. And so what it seems to me almost is as if there is always in people this question, from which side do you look at it? So I think the materialists or Aristotle or the scientific people, they look at it kind of from the bottom up. So they see all the small entities, and then they say, okay, if these entities are combined, then the form in which they are organized emerges, and so the form and organization exists as a consequence of the small entities existing. And so they build the whole worldview from the bottom up. And then there is the other possibility, which is more the Plato possibility, that you look at the world from the top down. So you say, no, there is this, the highest, perfect, best entity, which contains everything and is the foundation of everything. And then from this downward, different smaller entities exist which mirror the higher entity to a certain extent, but not completely. So you would say the materialists or the Aristotle types would say small things come together to build larger things, which are then maybe have emergent properties. And the Plato types would say large things have like echoes which have some aspect, but not all aspect of the large things, which are then the smaller things. So does that make any sense to you?
Yes, I understand, and yeah, that's very understandable that you sort of can compare and talk about bottom up or top to bottom approach when it comes to this metaphysical worldview. And that seems very true, that yes, in the more, you could say, Aristotelian or materialist sense, it's about things here at bottom that give rise to these forms or essences. But in Platonic worldview, it would be more the forms, and then everything else participates in those forms. And that would certainly be true in the theistic tradition as well, with the top to bottom, in the sense that God is the highest being, he is the supreme being, and then everything else participates in that. However, when it comes to arguments for the existence of God, most of them would argue from the bottom to the top, that we can look at things around us, concrete things that we can observe or discover, and reflect from that there must be a higher cause or an ultimate being that caused them to exist. So it would logically reflect about things around us, and by that logically conclude that there is this higher being. So the arguments would be more of a bottom to top approach, but the reality, the metaphysics of this worldview would be top to bottom, I suppose. Yeah, so that's an interesting reflection there. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good way to look at it, that theism is basically a top-down metaphysics. So you start with the top, with the perfect, as you said before, never changing, like self-sufficient foundation of all being. And then you say, okay, from this follow now different things which are smaller and have more limited aspects. And materialism is the bottom-up metaphysic, if you so want. So you start with small particles, and then these build things that have properties because of that. So yes, you said that the arguments for God often go from bottom to top, but I'm not sure I would agree. I think sometimes they do, but sometimes also they don't. So for example, you said in the beginning that God is like the foundation of all existence, and therefore we can derive certain of his attributes, like he would be necessary and self-sufficient and unchanging. And I think this is more of a top-down argument, isn't it?
Well, I should perhaps clarify that when I talk about that God would necessarily have these properties like self-sufficiency, etc., that would rather be um, logical conclusions based on the premise that this is what God is. But then some of the arguments for God existence, like the cosmological argument, wouldn't start with a premise that this is the essence of God. It would just start about, for instance, here we see things around us exist, and from that conclude that there is a God, and from there again, further down the road, you would argue for the properties. So I would, in this sense, what you were talking about was rather fleshing out the properties of God, given that we analyze God, to put it that way. But it's true that there are indeed there is at least one argument which argues more or less from the top to bottom, and that is the ontological argument, which talks about the concept of God as the greatest conceivable being, and derives from that because of this understanding of God, God must exist in reality. There are different versions of this argument, talking about the idea of possible worlds and necessity and all those stuff. But at least that's a very top to bottom approach. But take the contingency argument, or the argument from the motion. It would talk about things in the world around us. We see things change and move, and from there conclude that there must be an unmoved mover, like Aristotle also famously argued for, and then after that have the properties. So I hope that helped to clarify or distinguish things. I hope.
Yes, I think a little bit. I was a little bit stuck on when you said that somehow or other these you look at the world and from there conclude that God has to exist in reality. And I think again here it's very important to maybe be more precise about how, in what sense do we use the word exist here, because I think also as we move from the bottom to the top, things become less and less concrete. They become more and more abstract. So as we said, individual people or individual rocks, for example, exist, but distance or an economic system like socialism doesn't exist in the same level of concreteness, but it exists more abstractly because it's only a relationship between the entities that exist concretely. Now, of course, I'm again using the bottom-up worldview as I always somehow tend to do. But I think in that sense, you would have to, or for me at least, it would only make sense to say that God exists in reality, that this form of existence is somehow a very, very abstract form, like a principle or force or something like that, not like a concrete entity, like a stone.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I suppose a theist like myself would sort of make clear that it's talking about existence in a sense that things have being, that they have existence really and truly and actually, and not simply a relationship of beings, which is more like a shorthand for just saying that the beings categorized in this sense. So it would be, it's important for arguments to work, and it's talking about being, things that has existence, at least when it comes to some of the arguments, it's talking about being. And one could argue, or one could point out that some of the arguments starts from considerations about the concrete things around us, and then abstract from that certain properties or necessary relations or facts which are implied in the concrete things around us. To take an example, when it comes to mathematical or geometrical truths, you could talk about finding different forms of triangles around here, a triangle made of stone or wood or written on a paper or something. But when we talk about the properties of a triangle, like the Pythagoras, the theorem of Pythagoras. One would abstract from these concrete particulars and talk about the universal triangle, which is true of all triangles. And perhaps that's an analogy to how we talk about being when we talk about the contingency argument or other arguments, that we see these concrete things around us that has being. And it's very clear that we're talking about beings and not just relationships. We're talking about beings, and then abstract from that, well, what is true of what is universally true of these beings, and what sort of properties or necessary facts about being itself, which is true of all this being, are the things we must consider. So I'm not sure if that helps to answer that, but at least that's some important considerations.
Yes, I think it helps very much. So you say it's important from the theist perspective that God exists in the sense that there is an entity that really has being, if I understand you correctly. Okay, so, and you use the example of that we can find triangles in the material world, like in wood or in paper or whatever. But then if we want to know about the properties of a triangle, then we would, correct me if I say it wrong, we would abstract from these different triangles the universal triangle, which is kind of the basis or the foundation of what it means to be a triangle. And then we would look at the properties of this universal triangle.
Yes, that would be a way would sort of, it can be compared to how we talk about being in the arguments for God. That yes, we can abstract from triangles in particular, and then talk about the universal triangle and properties it must have. And then we know that when we have this mathematical truth about the universal triangle, that must be true of all triangles we see around us, because all of them has this triangularity, to put it that way. And in a similar sense, when it comes to some of the cosmological arguments, we see instances of being around us: trees, rocks, cars, houses, etc. And we reflect, well, what is true of them when we think about their being? And from there conclude that, well, these things are contingent, they exist but could possibly not have existed. It's possible for them not to exist, and therefore reflect that there must be an ultimate foundational cause for their existence. That's sort of where the contingency argument is going. So it's also they're talking about the being that they have and abstract from there in a sense.
Okay, so I see. So then it is not the fact that God is just this the concept of being somehow in the Platonic sense, like the universal triangle is somehow Plato's form of a triangle, right? And so being is somehow, there is the concept of being, and then there are individual entities that either have being or don't have being, but that's not the same as God, as I understand you, but God is more the cause that leads to certain things being and other things not being.
Right, so that when we see the things around us as being, and we reflect upon that fact that they have being and what that implies, we would therefore need to conclude that God exists.
Because he is the cause that this thing is now here instead of not here.
Yeah, that these things around us have being, and when we think about the implications of that, though that can only be explained and grounded in God, that is how you can make sense of these things we see around us.
Yes, I cannot follow this particular point of the argument, why then this leads to yes, to God, or, but yes, it's very difficult, because you seem to say that there needs to be a cause why something has being rather than doesn't have being.
Yes.
And if you assume this, then you say, okay, then there is kind of a universal cause for everything that exists, and this universal cause is then God.
Right, because it would, this is the famous contingency argument, that we see things exist, but then there's a question, well, what makes it the case that they in fact do exist? Because if it's possible for them not to exist, then why do they exist? And one could sort of extend this to reality, as we see, for instance, Leibniz, the famous German philosopher, would therefore put it this way, that the ultimate question would be, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does there exist anything whatsoever at all? And if it's possible for things to not exist, then we have to make sense of why they in fact do exist instead of not existing. And therefore that would necessarily lead one to conclude that there must be a necessary being, something that must exist in order to make sense of why possible things exist. And then we talk about the necessary being and reflect on what kind of properties must a necessary being have, then it leads us to the properties of God, like having an intelligent mind, being unchangeable, perfect, etc.
Yes, I'm sorry, but these things just don't necessarily follow for me. I even have a problem at the first step when you say some things exist, therefore there must be a cause that they have to exist. Why?
Well,
why can't it just be like, well, they just exist without a cause?
Well, yeah, I suppose it could be argued that take whatever thing as a specific entity and talk about it existing, and it's certainly possible for it not to exist. And one example of that is you have a book or a wallet in front of you, and you know that for say 1,000 years ago it did not exist, but now it does exist. So it's proof that it's not necessary, it's not absolutely necessary that it must exist in reality. So it would therefore be, you say, contingent. Its existence would not be grounded internally in itself, because if something had existence, and existence would be internal, it would be derived from the thing's essence, then it would necessarily exist because it must exist by its essence, and it would always exist. But we see with things around us that, yeah, they exist, but it's not that the existence comes from them internally, because it's possible for them not to exist. And therefore the only other alternative is that their existence is derived from something other than their essence or nature. So either existence comes internally and then it must necessarily exist, or the existence comes externally, i.e. being contingent upon other conditions or things to exist. I hope that helps clarify.
Yes, I think that does. I think I do understand now better this theory. So you say something exists, but as you said, if it's maybe a book, then it didn't exist some time ago, and so it doesn't necessarily have to exist, which is what you call contingent. But then its existence, its coming into existence, would depend on something else, which had to exist before. And so either this thing is also contingent on something else, or at some point you have like the infinite regress, and so you will have to have some thing which is not contingent or is not depending on something else to exist, but which just exists in and by itself. And then you could say, okay, what properties does this thing have to have? And then you would say, well, it is yeah, self-sufficient and unchanging and necessary and all that stuff. Yes, and I think looking at it from this way, it actually makes sense to me. And it's very interesting because I think that this is, I'm not sure, I haven't read Spinoza, but I think that this is kind of where the two different worldviews kind of meet, the bottom up or the top down. Because you could say, well, materialists say that matter and energy are convertible one into the other. So this is, I don't know, I'm also not an expert on this, but as far as I understand, this is what Einstein's famous equation says, that energy and matter can be converted into each other. So then there is something, is either energy or matter, which exists from the materialist point of view, which is also necessary, self-sufficient, unchanging, etc. It's the total sum of matter and energy is constant. It cannot be made larger or smaller because it only changes its internal form. And so this would then be kind of the same thing, if you so want, as what the theists call God.
But for a clarifying question, would it therefore be understood that this necessary being, is it identical to all material things, or is it rather a material thing in itself with which causes other material things to exist?
As I see it just now, I think, no, it's the sum total of all matter and energy.
Okay, but wouldn't it, if this necessary being is unchanging, wouldn't that be problematic if it is the sum total of all things, because all things around us change, they begin to exist, they cease to exist?
Yes,
so,
but the
yeah.
sum total doesn't.
Okay, so the total amount of matter or
Yes.
energy, if you want, will stay constant.
Yes.
Right, okay. But one could perhaps argue that the sum total doesn't have, perhaps I misunderstood the argument, that's very possible, but couldn't it be said that the sum total is simply a description of a number of things rather than something that exists in itself? And therefore, as we talked about earlier, it wouldn't be something that has existence itself, but rather, let's say, a relationship between beings, or just a categorization of being rather than something that has being in itself. And therefore, it would seem problematic that something that is merely a description could cause real existence, if I understand the argument correctly, of course.
Yes, but I don't think it is very problematic, because if you take any object in front of you, if you take a stone and you say this stone exists, well, of course you could break the stone into multiple smaller parts, but still you have no problem to say that the stone exists. Or you can say the earth exists, but myself and the stone and the house and the car is all a part of the earth, but still we have no problem to say that the earth as such exists. And so why can't we say that the sum total of all matter and energy exists?
Yeah, so the analogy was rather that when talking about the earth existing, that would be sort of the sum total of everything that is on earth, if I understood you correctly, of course. Is that?
Yes, exactly.
Right, okay. But I mean, couldn't it be argued that but this is, if you're going to talk about the existence of the earth in a much more technical and precise sense, they would sort of be the thing, and that we are not included in, but only the thing that we are standing on, that it's the material, natural planet, and we are just on it, if we're going to be very technical about it. or what do you think?
Yes, but you could, I don't know. Well, first of all, you would say basically it's everything except the human beings, because the air and that would also belong to the Earth. But you could say the solar system exists, or the Milky Way galaxy exists, or whatever. Or if I say my car exists, then I have no, this is not a contradiction to saying the seat and the seat belt and the driver's wheel and the glass of the windshield exist.
Right, okay, yeah, that might be a good point, but I suppose to drive the analogy further, and perhaps there is some problem with this analogy, but couldn't it be said that, take the solar system, that yeah, perhaps in a sense the total solar system is the sum total of all the planets and the star, etc. But still it would be problematic to say that the planets and stars are caused by the solar system as a whole, because the solar system as a whole is just a sum total of those things, so it couldn't be the cause of the things it contains. Similar with a car, that all the individual things that the car contains cannot be caused by the car as such, if that makes sense.
Yes, but the existence of matter and energy is in some sense the cause of everything that consists of this matter or energy. Because if the matter wouldn't exist, then the thing would also not exist.
Right, okay, but okay, so it says that yeah, everything is, ontologically speaking, just matter and energy. Would that be a presupposition?
I guess that would be the presupposition, yes.
Right, okay. But okay, but it wouldn't say that all sort of, so we would say that the sum total of all matter and energy is necessary, if I understand it correctly.
Yes.
Okay, but it would be false to say that a individual piece of matter, say the matter that is within my body or your body or a book, that piece of matter wouldn't be necessary, or would it?
Well, the substance that is the matter or energy is necessary, but it's not necessary that it takes this form.
Right, okay. Right, okay, but then perhaps there is the question of, well, what makes the matter have this or that specific form instead of another form?
Yes, the matter, all the rest of matter and energy that exist.
Right, but I suppose one could say that, well, things change having forms all the time. So I suppose one could say that, to put it in a more Aristotelian sense, that we have forms being potentially there and then being actualized by certain reorganizations of matter. But in order to make the matter reorganize and shift from one form to another, perhaps that it could be said that it must be something beyond the matter itself to organize it in a specific form. I'm not sure by that thought, but yeah, what do you think?
I think it's an interesting question. So I just asked myself, would a materialist say that potential exists? Which I find is I think kind of where your question goes, or which I find difficult to say. It certainly doesn't exist in the same sense as the things that actually exist, because it's only potentially, but still I mean, possibilities exist. I think that's not that's nothing that a material philosophy would deny. There are only contradictions cannot exist. So you cannot have a square circle table. That cannot exist. But something can, like maybe something is a tree at the moment, but it could become a table and a lot of scraps in the future. That certainly is possible. But of course, the thing that would cause this to happen would be other material or energy things that exist. So I think it's really kind of similar. It's just that you look at it from the opposite angle, the theistic or the materialistic view.
Right, because a materialist might argue that yes, potency or potentiality exists, like you seem to argue there. Right, but I suppose then if it could be said, if I understand it correctly, that the sum total of all matter and energy is necessary, but still it can change. If the sum total, or would you say that the sum total of matter can change only? Yeah, what would you say about change and the sum total?
I mean, the total, the amount doesn't change, but probably the internal order is changing all the time. I think yes.
Right, okay, so we would change internally.
Yes.
Right, okay. Because one could perhaps make the argument that if it changed internally, that means that there is something beyond the thing itself which makes it change. Because if all the change that happened internally in a thing is caused by the thing itself, then why wouldn't it change earlier? If the thing itself were sufficient for a specific form to take place, then why wouldn't it gain that form earlier if the thing itself is sufficient for that, if that makes sense? That perhaps.
There's also an interesting point here, I think. So your question seems to imply that things, correct me if I'm wrong, that things progress towards some state.
Yeah,
kind of teleological. So
well, not exactly, just that we see that if things change from one state to another, then one can argue, well, what makes it change from that state to another? If it's the thing in itself caused that change, then why? Yeah, it seems problematic to say that the thing itself causes one state instead of another, because I'm not sure if I make myself
I think I understand your point. You're kind of saying, well, if it has a certain state and then this state changes, then there must have been a cause which must have, if the cause was there before, then why didn't it change before? And if the cause wasn't there before, then where did it come from?
Yes, that's a good sort of illustration.
But couldn't you say that something is just, it's in itself like a process? So like if you imagine that the whole universe would just exist of two rocks which are circling around a common center point, then you could say, well, at some time or maybe they are even like elliptically circling around this. No, let's keep it simple. They're just circling around this common center point. Then at one moment, the rock is here, and at the next moment, he is here. But the cause for this change is still within the whole system. It's just that one thing is in motion, and then there you go. Yes, you would ask for the unmoved mover. Why is something even in motion in the first place?
That's a good point.
Right? I think that's where the problem goes to. So because if something is moving and then it bumps into something else, and then this thing starts moving, and then it just continues on forever. But I think the theist would then maybe ask, well, why is it moving in the first place?
Yeah, or for instance, why does it move in that particular speed instead of another speed? Or one could just ask, okay, it's moving, but let's say a specific moment, the rock is there and the other rock is there. Well, why is it specifically there instead of another place in this circle? So
yes, I don't think that the theory that I have described here has an answer for this. I think the answer would just be, well, it just is.
right, but that wouldn't establish the existence or conditions that are in reality, though. Since of the principle that either existence must come internally from a thing or externally.
So you're saying the state of all matter and energy is not internally determined by itself.
Right, it's not intrinsically necessary that it be in this state, so it couldn't be the necessary grounding.
Yep, I see that problem. Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. Yep. Somehow for me, it's not such a problem to just imagine that always one thing leads to the next without having a clear defined starting point. But I see what you say, that you would always have to say, well, the state of the universe at the moment depends on the state that it had before, and that depends again on the state that it had before, and like to infinity.
Yeah, one could take it back to why does it have to have this state and then draw it backwards in time, but also one can argue that why is it a specific way in this specific moment? What makes it that condition right now instead of another? So one could think of it as an hierarchical things, not just a linear things back in time, but also what power actualizes the existence or this state as of this moment.
Yes, well, there I would say it's just the moment before.
Well, one could point out that the moment before doesn't exist right now, so you couldn't ground the condition in this specific moment, since the previous moment is no longer existing.
Well, but then you seem to assume that there doesn't necessarily need to be constancy of existence.
Yeah, that
so something could exist in one moment and then just not exist in the next moment.
Yeah, right. It's entirely possible that it might just cease to exist. So therefore, there must be a foundation or explanation for why it continues to exist.
And that is again where the theist would say that this foundation that makes it so is God.
Yeah, ultimately, yes.
Because else something could just stop to exist or come into existence, or why shouldn't it?
Right.
There must be a reason why this doesn't happen.
Yes.
And this reason then is God. Okay. Well. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, if you assume that this could in fact be that something just stops existing or starts existing, but it's because of some reason it doesn't happen, then yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to say to it. I can see that you say, okay, then there needs, in the end, though, I would say maybe that you haven't really made a lot of, or is that true? I wanted to say you haven't really made a lot of progress with this explanation. So instead of, well, no, actually, that's not true. It's okay, I see. So you're saying there needs to be a cause that, yeah, this doesn't happen. Something just starts existing or stops existing. And so this cause that makes this so is what we call God. And I think this is not different from materialists saying that matter and energy adhere to certain unchangeable principles. So again, we come to the fact, or to the comparison, that we could compare God to an unchanging principle.
But perhaps I was asked to be more specific what one means by principle. Do you mean a thing that has being? Because one could perhaps describe God as an ultimate principle, but one would be specific that what do you mean by principle?
Yes. I think a principle is kind of, in my mind, it's the highest abstraction. It's, again, if we start from the bottom with the material things, and then we have relationships between material things, and then somehow a principle that applies to all material things is kind of the highest abstraction in this chain of abstractions. So it certainly doesn't exist in the same way that an individual piece of matter or energy exists, because it's a principle about these things.
Like some sort of existential law about how being is to operate, or?
Yes, like some sort of universal law, yes.
Well, I suppose I would argue that this sort of existential law might be a property or principle of how being behave, but it's not something that has being in itself. So like the laws of physics, it would be more a description of how being itself or beings operate, rather than something that has being itself, which caused being into existence.
Well, that depends. If you say, well, this universe as it is exists, and it follows these laws, then the laws also exist, because here everything is and follows these laws.
Right, but in one could say that the laws are not things existing in itself, but rather descriptions of material things operating under certain conditions. And therefore, it's absurd to talk about it existing and causing existing under that view.
Well, yes, that's what happens when you take the bottom-up view.
Well, I suppose I would argue that a sort of necessary foundation, since it would be the source of existence, that it must contain existence in some way or another, because you cannot cause something that you yourself don't contain in some way or another. It's called the principle of proportionate causality, that in order to give something, you must have that thing in order to give it to somebody else. And therefore, if something is to cause existence, then it must have existence. In order to give being, it must be being or have being, if that makes sense.
I feel like I understand that in order to give something, you have to have it first, but in some sense also it seems a little bit like a language game instead of like a actual description of reality. I'm unsure how I should say what I mean. So to my mind, as we said, there are different levels of existence, and you seem to say that only something which exists at the level of substance can make it so that some other substance exists.
Right, a substance that its existence must be so to give existence.
Yes. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would agree with that statement, but then, as I said, all matter and energy is the substance that exists, and it gives a book could not exist if not all matter and energy did exist. So there you have the substance that gives rise to other substance. And then you say, well, why is the state of all matter and energy like this rather than different? And then I say, well, this is because there seems to be the law that all matter and energy behaves according to certain kind of like laws. So it doesn't just behave randomly, but it behaves according to certain properties. And then you say, well, do these properties in themselves exist in the same way as matter exists? And then I would say no, because they are properties of these things that exist. And then you say, well, but then the properties cannot cause the state of the things because they don't have existence.
Right, and I want to clarify that when I talk about the cause must have existence, that doesn't necessarily mean material existence, because I would argue that the cause must be immaterial and unchanging.
Okay, but then these properties of how matter and energy behave would fit that description perfectly, wouldn't they? They are unchanging. They don't have they are unchanging and they don't have matter. They are immaterial. They are principles that describe how something is.
Right, but one thing I would also say about those principles is that, as you say, they are truths about how matter will operate. Is that correct?
I think so, yes.
Right, but it would only be true about, yeah, this is how matter operates. It wouldn't be something that compels reality to make matter exist, that it causes matter. It would just be something telling about what matter will necessarily do in its essence, not something that tells that reality must contain matter. So that's the distinction, to put it that way.
Yes, but I don't think you can separate the properties from the entity itself. This is like what Aristotle always pointed out, that you cannot have an entity without properties and you cannot have properties without the entity.
Yes.
And so these laws or principles are not separate from the matter and energy that exist, but they are the same thing.
Right, but then the principles cannot be the cause of those entities, since it is a part of the entities.
What?
If I understand it correctly, of course.
So you seem to say that something can only affect something else, but not itself.
Right. That something can, if something causes something else to exist, then it must be another thing. It cannot be a part of what it causes to exist.
Hmm.
So that's why the principles cannot be a necessary foundation.
I find it difficult to hold the thing together still, but I still feel like my realization is actually accurate, that the thing viewed from the bottom or from the top is the same thing, just from a very different perspective. But I cannot at the moment I mean, I see your point where you make the distinction between the theistic and the materialistic view, because the theistic view would say God is the ultimate cause, but he causes these other things to exist. Whereas I am more saying like the whole thing is the cause and its properties cause its internal state to exist. I think that's the analogy.
Properties cause the thing being in a specific condition in that specific moment.
Yes.
Right. Okay. But these properties, would you say that the properties themselves are necessary and unchanging?
Yes, probably.
Okay. And the properties but if the properties are not sufficient and necessarily causing these internal states, or if the properties are sufficient and necessary to cause these states, then why didn't it cause the condition before? One can ask, and then have the same problem of why is it this way, not that way?
Well, that's just because that's the way the properties are.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
So, for example, why doesn't matter and energy behave so that, I don't know, an elephant pops out of, like, starts to exist here right now at the moment? Well, that's just how the properties of matter and energy are, that something like this doesn't happen.
Right, yeah, because it would be impossible for matter to just make new things exist out of nothing with no cause, you mean?
Not necessarily, it's just that that's the way the properties are. It's like, maybe in the analogy you could ask, well, why didn't God make the earth so that this and this is the case? And the answer is just, well, that's not what he wanted to do. He just wanted to do this, or he just...
Right. But then with God, one will say that it's possible for him to create such and such a world. But I'm not sure if you mean that the properties of this material thing if it's possible for it to cause another state or condition to be the case.
But is it really possible? Because you said that the absolute foundation of being is necessary and unchanging.
Yes.
So if it's necessary, then it couldn't be in a different way.
Yeah, true. About God, he couldn't be in any other way, but the things that he creates, they are contingent and could be another way.
Well, but why?
Well, because there is nothing intrinsically impossible for God to create another world with such and such things. Now, of course, logically contradictory things like a squared circle, that's impossible, but there is nothing intrinsically impossible for him to create a new house at a specific location, because there's nothing to make that impossible. It's not.
I think that's for me difficult to understand, because if you say from existence we find an absolute foundation which is necessary and self-sufficient and unchanging, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to me that this foundation could also lead to a completely different existence.
Well, yeah, not concerning the thing itself. That would be absolutely necessarily the same way that it is now. It couldn't be another way, God in himself. But other things that he creates, these are not necessary, unchanging. These can be whatever gods want, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I always try to translate it into the other view, but there I think it's probably the same. So you could say, yeah, it's, for example, as we said before, it's not impossible that matter and energy will make a table out of a tree.
A table out of a tree. Yeah, I mean, okay, so sorry.
I see how it could create other things. I feel like I'm starting to get confused and tired also, but yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe I have to try to understand the theist argument just in its pure form instead of trying to translate it to something else.
Right, and there's also other reasons why the necessary foundation couldn't be material. For instance, yeah, I mentioned this in an earlier video as well, that the foundation cannot consist of parts. That must be simple in the sense that it doesn't have parts in it.
The foundation cannot consist of parts.
Right. And matter is, of course, consisting of parts, so therefore can't be that.
Why can't it consist of parts?
Well, the reason is that a thing that has parts, that would mean that in order for the thing to be that very thing, it must have those parts, or else it wouldn't be that thing. But that means that there is a principle outside of the thing itself, which makes it that the parts are arranged the way they are and be the thing itself, if that makes sense. That's very abstract metaphysics, of course. But it's basically that if there must be, one can ask, what makes it the case that those parts are arranged the way they are instead of not? And that principle which arranges them in that way cannot be the thing itself, because the thing itself presupposes those parts being there. So it must be something beyond the thing itself that organizes the thing. But then it wouldn't be independent and necessary anymore. So it couldn't be a necessary foundation.
I start to feel like you have kind of this God that you describe is kind of like a squared circle. It's like a contradiction in itself, because you keep saying the principle that arranges the parts cannot be the same thing as the ultimate cause itself. But then you keep saying that the ultimate cause exists in reality and not just like a principle.
Right, yeah, I'm explaining why therefore it's impossible for that necessary foundation to consist of parts, because of this problem of external principles, and that therefore it must be simple in the sense that it's not consisting of parts.
Yes, but now either it is a principle or it's not a principle. So is the ultimate cause, or is God as you understand it, a principle or not?
Well, I mean, I suppose one could call him a principle, but one needs to clarify that he's a principle that has being.
And what does that mean? How can a principle have being?
Yeah, that depends on what one's mean by principle. I'm not sure how to define it, I must confess.
Because I think just now, I think there is kind of a problem. Because yes, it seems to me that if something has being like an entity, then there would be a certain principle or certain rules that describe how it is, and then these rules are not part of the thing itself. But yes, so that's what you said with the model that I said. Well, the laws of how matter operates cannot create the matter itself. But then you seem to say that God is like a single principle or a single I'm not sure if you said that it is a principle or if I said that, but either it is a principle or it's not. But I think this idea of a principle that has being like an entity is kind of like a squared circle.
Well, I mean, okay, well, let's say we accept that reality of a principle, then okay, we may say that God is not a principle. And yeah, okay.
Yes, okay, but then the question is, what is it then?
Well, of course, it's not really possible to describe it directly, the essence of the thing, but we would say that it has, or God has being. So that's as far as we come with regards to his existence, that he has being, and unlimited being.
But as far as I understand, that's an axiomatic claim, because you would say if he doesn't have being himself, then he couldn't create other things that have being.
Right, and that's why the cause of all things must have being. Yeah.
So it's like a cause of all things that has being, but it doesn't consist of parts.
Right.
And causes all other things, but could also cause them differently. Yeah, it's also a bit confusing, I have to admit.
Well, it's deep metaphysics.
Yes, yes. I can't put my finger on it anymore right now, but just there for a moment, I was quite certain that what you are talking about seems to have like contradictory properties.
Okay. Yeah, well, if it is the case that a principle cannot have being like an entity, then okay, it's not that God is not a principle. So okay, we can perfectly grant that if it's the case that principles cannot be beings.
Yes. Yeah, of course, this still doesn't solve the question then what it actually is, because yeah, but I think maybe we have to leave it at that. I don't know where to go further.
Right. Yeah, we have talked many minutes, over an hour, longer than an hour. So yeah, we can conclude the conversation this time, and perhaps we can continue this inquiry on another occasion, another conversation, if of course you want to, of course. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not opposed to continue it. It's very complicated stuff, and it's sometimes very difficult to even just try to express in words what you think. So it won't be the easiest video to watch, but maybe people who are also interested in this question, they will understand the difficulty to formulate the thoughts.
Yeah, it might be with when it comes to deep metaphysical ideas. So that's why specific terms and words are usually very useful there. So that, for instance, the principle of proportionate causality, if one understands it, one can just mention that and people understand what you mean. So yeah, I understand what you mean, absolutely.
Okay, but thank you for the conversation. It was very interesting.
Yes, very interesting and productive, I would say. So thank you very much, Amos, for joining me in this conversation. So yeah, I'll wish you and the audience a great Friday and a great weekend, and hopefully everything will go okay, even though it's Friday the 13th.
Yes, I think this conversation went well, at least, and I wish you also a good weekend.
Great, thank you. Okay, and also if anyone in the audience has some very, if they have some remarks or comments, then you can just leave a comment in the comment section on YouTube, and we'll be sure to read it, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.